It's my pleasure to introduce the chair for the next panel, Sedonna Goeman-Shulsky from the Tonawanda band of Seneca. She is a PhD student at UCLA at the Institute of Environment and Sustainability and a tribal outreach contractor for the Native American Land Conservancy. And I keep this brief. You have all the big bios in the package or online. And I hand over to Sedonna.
Thank you. I'm really excited to introduce the panelists today, Keshia DeFreece Lawrence, who is Ramapough Lenape Indigenous American from Rhode Island. And Ms. DeFreece Lawrence holds a bachelor's degree in international relations and global politics from the American University of Rome, a master's degree in international law and the settlement of disputes from the United Nations mandated University for Peace, Costa Rica, and her most recent educational victory. Ms. DeFreece Lawrence's undergraduate academic work has focused on hard reconciliation and sovereignty methods for Indigenous nations, while her graduate academic work is expanding to include climate policy and action in Indigenous realities. Among Ms. DeFreece Lawrence's recent achievements is holding awards for Model United Nations Best Delegate, in addition to being an invited presenter at the University of California, Berkeley 10th Annual International Conference on the Constructed Environment. Currently, she is a program coordinator for an international environmental nonprofit, Earthwatch Institute, and is working on publishing her master's dissertation titled The Arctic Circle, Climate Change, International Law, and Indigenous Heritage. This is something that's really close to me, and I just want to say briefly, I'm so excited to read your work once it's published and hear what you have to say about it, because it's very relevant to my work too. So I can't wait to talk to you more about it. Yeah, that would be lovely.
Thank you. Good morning. Hello, or good afternoon. Kulamasi. My name is Talking Waters, or Pemetunhepi, which actually means preaching waters. So I'm Ramapough Lenape Muncie. For those of you coming from different parts of the United States, that might mean something. Lenape, we are Eastern people, although a lot of us have been pushed west. So states like Wyoming is actually a Lenape word. Anadarko, Oklahoma houses my people now. Parts of Wisconsin, Stockbridge, Muncie. However, I come from the only state recognized branch of my nation, the ones who stayed also. And up north, we have multiple reservations that now are essentially in Muncie that hold the northern door that is still a part of the East. So I come from two branches of clans within my nation, which is Deer and Wolf. Deer was originally Turkey, which is because of the Tuscarora and the mixing essentially that happened. I also want to point out that I'm coming from mountain people, although I am a suburban Indian. I come from mountain people. We are the mid and northern portion of Appalachia. So please don't let that be missed. I also come from a hereditary line of medicine people turned treaty makers turned essentially warriors. Samuel DeFreece, going back in my family, was the first Ramapough that is recognized as a medicine man in the state of New Jersey. We also exist in New York, and we still hold true our footpaths that carry us that way. We're known as keepers of the past, meaning we determine who goes into the northern door and who doesn't. So my research and what I'm studying is close to me and ultimately my blood memory in a lot of ways. So we talked a lot about identity and names, and I kind of want to talk about essentially the fact that my tribe has adopted many colonizer names. My middle name is DeFreece, which is also Dutch. We have survived the Swedish, the Finnish, we've survived the British. We have also survived that one Italian that came through Verrazano Bridge. Yeah. And today we are also surviving essentially the EPA. My nation sits on 5 Superfund sites, 5 Superfund sites. All of which are the only ones to be announced in this country, closed and reopened and closed and reopened and closed and reopened again. When we talk about ecocide, when we talk about genocide, for Indigenous people, it's the same thing. So today, I'm gonna add a little bit more about who I am. So the other day we had many a Haudenosaunee woman come here and kind of lay the mic down for what it means to be an Eastern woman, and I'm here to pick it back up again and then drop it. So a little bit further, my maternal grandfather is, in terms of my ancestors and the genetics that as well as stories I carry with me, Tuscarora, Tappan, Wappinger, Lenape, Montauk, Seneca, Mohawk, Pequot. My last name is Lawrence. Please look up Pequot Lawrence's. Shinnecock, and Ramapough. My father is the son of the first freed man in my family. I'll say that again. My father, who is 67, is the son of the first freed Black man in my family. My grandfather was raised by a big mama in North Carolina. Big mamas are women that took in lost children. It's the auntie system for Black America. However, despite being designated Black and a slave, my grandfather to this day, going in his late 90s, identifies as Native American. My maternal grandmother is Northern Irish. And when she came to this country, she knew she needed to marry a Native American because nobody else would understand her. I'll leave it at that. So I have some rules of conduct for the anti-colonial journey I plan on taking you all today. Do not use the word steward. I am nobody's janitor. No Indigenous person in this room is a janitor of this planet. It is everybody's responsibility to take care of this planet, not just Indigenous people. Do not honor the treaties. We want new ones. I appreciate being labeled the generation of belief, but I'm the generation of demands. Ecocide is Indigenous Jim Crow, plain and simple. Mother Earth has no straight lines, so what you see on a map is a lie. The continent of Africa, that is a lie. Those country borders are not perfect squares. Never expect the colonial tools to work or explain anything because they weren't made by us. I'm saying this as somebody that spent 1.5 years at a United Nations institution, followed by UN internships, followed by closely working with the former president of Kiribati, President Tadboro Titu, also one of the first Indigenous politicians and presidents for island nations. And he too would agree that it doesn't work. Also, and we heard this the very first night, invaders, not settlers. Some settlers, I will say, if you ask to be where you are and communicate with the nations whose land you're on and around, then maybe you're a settler, but overall invader. And I push that one step further for those of us who are aware of Indigenous resistance and frontline realities. Don't be an ally, be a comrade, be in community with people. One more. Land back and water back can happen in multiple ways, and that's what I will be presenting on. There are some words of significance that I might use: environmental consent, ecocide, eco-literacy, eco-empathy, queer ecology, non-binary ecology, eco-armor, or an armed ecos. If you know Yogi Berra from baseball, there's Yogi Berra-isms. I like to think I have my own. So with that being said, I would like everyone to just repeat after me for a second. I am sovereign. My nature is sovereign. This planet can give consent. So the photos here is the Churchill Northern Studies Center, which houses a lot of scientists and a lot of good research and a lot of great people. This location was also able to house me for a period of time while I did on the ground in the field scientific research. So you all have heard that my background is in international law and a lot of politics. I know who my constituents are and I know who they aren't. With that being said though, how do we not allow the environment to be weaponized, but politicized through Indigenous voice and Indigenous voice only? Okay. So these are a few questions. Please think about them to yourself. If you've ever lived, worked, or traveled to the subarctic or Arctic regions, what does the word Arctic even mean to you? What portion of the world are you envisioning? Are you envisioning just your home country possibly? Are you envisioning just Alaska? Are you envisioning natives that look a certain way, Or are you also including white indigenous people? When we think about the Arctic, there are countries or states, because the United States, we actually use the word state incorrectly. We should be the United Nations, not the United States of America, but that's a side note. When we think about the Arctic languages, do you know of any? Can you think of any? Can you think in any Arctic languages? Have you ever heard of the term environmental refugees? Keep thinking about that. So the Arctic today, can I take this out and walk around, or am I stuck here? I'm a nomadic person. That's okay, I can stay here, I'll work on it. Okay, so the Arctic Circle in terms of politics and colonial politics, there are 8 member states: Canada, Russia, Norway, the Kingdom of Denmark, which would extend to Greenland, the United States, Finland, Iceland, and Sweden. On the side of that, we have the indigenous representation that is allotted or allowed for the Arctic Council. The Inuit Circumpolar Conference, the Arctic Athabascan Council, Gwich'in Council, the Aleut International Association, Russian Association of Indigenous People of the North, and the Sami Council. So we have Russia, Norway, arguably Alaska, and parts of Canada recognized. But we are missing some to a certain extent if you immediately only think of what nations actively recognize these people. We see that even in the term, Russia is not identifying the names of their indigenous people. Thank you. Oh, wait. Oh, yep. Thank you. So I bring this up in terms of a map because Churchill, it's right here, this place called Hudson's Bay. And that's where I was. Now, this is a small portion of the Arctic, and all of these different colors are meant to identify what countries have a stake in the Arctic or own the Arctic, if you will. So the Arctic Council, although a beautiful reality of trying to have indigenous people come together and politician makers come together, and in theory, scientists come together and talk about this portion of the world that determines the rest of the world's climate, they don't do legally binding things. I brought up UNDRIP earlier and the fact that it's not legally binding. We have an entity, a full-blown powerhouse, not just a written one-time document. We have people that change. The Arctic Council is run, if you will, by different countries every so often. When I was writing my thesis, we were under the United States rule and had been from the Obama administration into what is known as the Trump administration. Today, it is Russia. I don't even want to begin with how problematic that is, right? But we know it is. And for the indigenous people of Russia, they're suffering right now. Russia does not share most of their scientific findings with the Arctic Council. When you go in to look at their various documents, we see a very Turtle Island sharing approach of information. And that's coming from also non-indigenous people that sit on these councils, right? But that's not necessarily shared the same way. And we're starting to see more of a voice coming from the indigenous representation that I showed earlier. The Sami have been extremely active in recent years and continue to be. So within my research, aside from the political background that is what is happening in the Arctic right now, I wanted to look at the other pole, right? Scientifically thinking in terms of the Western Anglo version of science, the Arctic and the Antarctic are seen as places of research, but we have a difference. Antarctic has its own treaty system where early on colonizers decided no one can own this, no one can utilize it. And they tell us nobody's ever lived there before. As indigenous people, we know that's not true. We just know that's not true. We have creation stories that tell us otherwise. If there are, there's millions of different types of whales that come to Antarctica to give birth and that rest within these areas. For all coastal people, we had our own versions of whalings. We had our own boat societies, some of whom stories line up with each other. So how do we apply our creation stories to scientific truth, but more importantly, also environmental law? The Antarctic Treaty System was one of the first modes of protecting an environment, even for a colonizer's point of view. You cannot go to Antarctica unless you are doing research. Now, International Whaling Commission, Maritime Organization has had a lot of issues with states like Japan, who are whaling too far, a little too close to Antarctica, and coming in contact, but also infringing upon Indigenous people's rights. The Maori have been vocal about having a lot of issues with Japanese ships coming too close to their territory, and ultimately to continue to this one that we all have a stake in and a right to. But there's a difference when it comes to the Arctic. So for me, the Arctic Circle, the only people that have a right to determine what politically happens here and literally happens here are the people who still live there and the people whose mitochondrial DNA bring them there. So my issue essentially with the Arctic Circle is when you look at essentially over the 90 international documents, and when I'm using international with reference to the UN, although I want to keep in mind not every country in the world is a part of the UN, and countries are being made every single day. The Vatican See has more of a say at the UN, the Holy See, excuse me, the Vatican, has more of a say at the UN than Palestine. So please weigh these things heavily in your mind when we talk about the environment. So for the Arctic, we have issues. We have a lot of issues. There are hundreds of internationally legally binding documents. None of them are for the Arctic Circle, not one. So anything could happen in the Arctic. And since I've done my research, which was in 2019, I just want to point out what has changed in the Arctic. As of a few weeks ago, snow crab season is officially over. That was as of October, I believe, 19, 2022. Russia is leading the Arctic Council until 2023. The Arctic Council convention was held in Iceland and just ended a few weeks ago, and it was the first time Indigenous youth were brought to the council and brought to be a part of this convention. I had 2 friends there. The Arctic reached 100 degrees Fahrenheit for the first time in global history, global recorded history. China is a self-declared Arctic state and is now bidding for North Korea to be included in that. The Northwest Passage is open, meaning the ice no longer stays frozen there. There is no longer land masses there. The waterways are wide open. On top of that, moose diseases, tick diseases, aurora borealis has extended much lower than ever before. I point out all of these things because ultimately all of these things are ecocide that directly and only impact the people. So pan-indigeneity is quite a problematic statement nowadays. I'm very aware of this, and I don't care because I'm not talking solely about us as people. I'm not solely talking about a monolith here. I'm talking about the indigeneity of the environment and the planet. Pangea as a concept, as a scientific belief and fact of the continental shifts and these plates changing, right? We had a literal version of pan-indigeneity at one point through the environment all being connected, and we've lost that. But how do we tie our traditional ways into protecting this environment? How do we have gender fluid and also environmentally fluid laws? My issue with environmental policy nowadays is the fact that it doesn't include our elders' stories, and it doesn't include the humility and the ability for change that Indigenous people naturally include in our lessons and naturally include in our day-to-day life. It could rain right now, I don't know, and that's okay. When I was in the North, I had an elder tell me that the sky was falling. That, first of all, took me a long time to try to figure out how to translate, but it took me a while to realize what that meant, and that was directly tied to aurora borealis. I don't want to go too deeply into this because I actually have an activity for you all. Could I have all Indigenous to Turtle Island people stay exactly where you are? I'm not going to move you. We've done a lot of displacing. I'm done with it. Stay where you are. My non-Indigenous to Turtle Island people, though, please stand up. I need 9 of you. If we have 9 of you, come on over, or whoever out of who is standing would like to be a participant, please come on up. Well, this is going to be difficult if not all creations. Do I have a few Native people willing to partake? One more. Beautiful. So, the rest of you are negotiators. I come from Eastern Woodlands, we're treaty people. So you are all now one nation. And it is your job to negotiate. Oh, sorry, people on Zoom. So I come from the Eastern Woodlands. We're treaty people. We believe in negotiations before we get crazy and fight. Those of you here, you are all one nation. You are all treaty people now. But it is your job to work together and figure out what these lost souls have on their paper and what they mean. So there's branches of 3 people that will be together here. Okay? So all of you need to read what you have on your paper. I will hand off the mic for that. Like I said, we're going to have, for example, those 3. Ideally, you will end up together. I don't know what's on your paper. I'm just giving an example. Maybe these 3 will be together. But it is your job to figure out what the colonial words on their paper mean for the indigenous proverbs that are also on other pieces of paper, because all of this will tie to factual science. So I want you to put together creation stories right now, okay? What is on your paper?
Matriarchy of water space.
Beluga whale.
Wood frog.
Permafrost.
Boreal forest frog.
Earth equals brackish water.
Survival is in the clan name.
Drunken trees.
Puberty is changing for the worse.
The men are shrinking with grieving ecological grief.
Language, place, space, identity, all living and dying.
Where the sky and ground are falling.
All right, so with that being said, and from what you've heard, who do you think belongs together? Anyone can go first. And ideally talk to each other. You all can also try to help each other up here if you want.
Should we move or do they tell us where we live?
You all can move. Ideally, they would be giving you feedback of maybe brackish water goes with the matriarch of the ocean. I don't know. It requires listening and thinking. But you all can move. So I can read them. We have beluga, wood frog, boreal forest frog, permafrost, matriarch of space within seas, brackish waters. The men are shrinking with growing ecological grief. Survival is in the clan name. Puberty, a comment about puberty. Drunken trees, where the sky and ground are falling. Language and place and space. All right, so those of you up here, this isn't necessarily meant to make sense, right? We've been dislocated across a whole continent. We all speak thousands upon thousands of different languages. The confusion you feel is natural. So those of you up here that think you've got it and have found your 2 other people or ecosystems, you should be in groups of 3. So once I see groups of 3, All right, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Can I see groups of 3? I'm curious how this happened. So our first group of 3, whichever that may be, can I see you? I don't know what happened to the other mic. If you want to take it, Martha, and tell me who you all are.
Matriarchy of water space. Survival is in the clan name.
And birth is brackish water.
That is incorrect, but that's okay. I think that's interesting. Did you go with a water theme?
Kinship.
Okay. All right. A next grouping of 3.
Where the sky and ground are falling.
Beluga whale.
Language, place, space, identity, all living and dying.
2 of you are correct. However, back up, Irina, I'm sorry. So you do step aside, stay together. All right. Next group of 3.
Wood frog.
Okay.
Boreal forest frog.
And drunken trees.
No. Next group of 3.
Permafrost.
The men, I don't know what the women know, are shrinking with grieving ecological grief.
Puberty is changing for the worse.
So 2 of you are correct. Ecological grief and puberty. The other one is incorrect. So to save a lot of things, I'm going to say them, okay? Beluga, matriarch of space and seas. Birth happens preferably in brackish waters. Those things go together because while doing my research, I got to canoe with beluga whales. I also got to sing some songs with them, but I learned from elders that where belugas tend to give birth is now hunting grounds for orcas. But traditionally where they give birth is, understandably, the songs kind of call them the matriarchs of the seas. And so that's beginning to change, but they give birth in brackish water. So where we have Arctic seas meet fresh water of Turtle Island for the first time. So thank you, you all can sit. Wood frog, the men are shrinking with ecological grief, and puberty is essentially horrible right now. What does that mean? So wood frogs are one of 2 frogs that are indigenous to the Arctic, but also extend deeply into Turtle Island, all the way to Georgia, essentially. And wood frogs, I found from my research and some other scientists from University of North Carolina, Raleigh, that were studying at Churchill, that the men are shrinking. The male wood frogs are no longer growing to full size, but the females are getting larger. And an elder told me they're mad at the land. That's why. They have ecological grief and they're not able to reproduce the same way they would. The men are not traveling the same way they would. And it's essentially causing them to make themselves endangered. So we have where life and death are meeting, but also causing a lot of issues. So you all can sit down. Thank you. Boreal forest frog, survival is in the clan name, and drunken trees. Yeah. So okay, you did? Lovely. All right. So boreal forest frogs are bright green, and they also tie to the boreal forests of the Arctic. For those of you that might be familiar with some Arctic nations, frogs are important, and frogs represent some clans. Hence, survival is in the clan name, because survival, we need the boreal forest to survive in order for the frogs to survive, in order for the clan to survive. Drunken trees is a phenomena of trees essentially not being able to grow as thick as they once would. So the boreal forest is what is experiencing that the most. Thank you. Drunken trees is not a completely scientific name, but it is accepted right now. And lastly, we have permafrost, where the sky and the ground are falling, and then language and place. Those come together because permafrost is falling. So permafrost is the coldest parts of the ground, essentially, and what has survived through many an ice age. And permafrost, while doing some of my research, I fell through permafrost. I fell through tundra waters many a time. So the ground is literally falling. Aurora borealis, I mentioned, an elder told me the sky was falling, and it's because of how low aurora borealis now comes. And I think it's important to note that Arctic people determine their seasons based on what they see. There is a polar bear season. There is an aurora borealis season. If climate change continues, they lose their seasons. That's more than language, and that's more than culture. You lose place, you lose environment. And that's it. I am gonna pull up my thesis and the long chart that shows the Arctic has no international law protecting it. Thank you.
So while Keshia's scrolling, if anybody has questions right now, I know that was very thought-provoking for me, that exercise and the talk. I'm wondering if right off the bat there are any questions, or if it would be beneficial to sit with thoughts and with each other for a couple seconds, couple minutes before. If you have a question, okay, great.
Thank you, Keshia. That was very fascinating. It's not directly related to a lot of the stuff you talked about, but that's all really wonderful. I wanted to actually hear more about the kind of work you did when you were up north. Was it a blend of like Indigenous knowledge and scientific approaches? Like, what did that work look like?
Yeah, I mean, you can see the dates on here, right? So I did actual in the field scientific research for only 1 week. And what that means is, I collected over 3,000 tadpoles that were wood frog. Oh, okay. I'm sorry, Zoom people. So collected over 3,000 tadpoles, all of which were wood frog males. Water sampling in terms of pH, acidity, looking at the turbidity, and using science as a way to communicate with the land again. I don't speak my native tongue. However, I speak various portions of Algonquin, various portions of Ojibwe, various portions of Cree, so other people's languages. And I have grown up being told from the colonial system that I can't do math and science despite my mother being a former NASA chemist. So for me, that then means for Indigenous youth, for next generation thinkers, we have to be in the field on the land the way the colonizers are in order to defend our space. Because if the next engineers of the world are all Indigenous, then we won't have ecocide in theory if we follow our teachings the way we're supposed to. So although I was only in the field doing Caucasian science for a week, that was followed by me still staying in the Arctic for another month and working with a lot of Métis Dene, acknowledging that Churchill sits directly on Dene land. And yeah, really networking in my own ways for what Indigenous science could be and how do we sovereignize science. I'm from this experience, as well as being on various front lines, I've created my own LLC, which is called Sovereign Science, and it's essentially an Indigenous science think tank. So offering these abilities for Indigenous youth to be on the land, develop our own environmental impact statements. It means nothing if we have companies do it for us. They're designed to lie to us anyway. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's wonderful work.
I'm holding the mic, so I just want to ask a quick question before I pass it. So I've noticed that you put up like slips of paper on the walls, and I'm wondering if you could talk about that exercise and what you're doing with that.
Yeah, am a typical native and long-winded and don't know what time means, right? So I had put I wanted to do kind of an ecocide, 4 corners, if you will. There's 4 different words on the wall that are places in the subarctic that I visited, some of which are sites of ecocide in terms of how some of us may think of it as just destruction or dumping pollution. And then others that are sites of just colonial ecocide, a national park. And I originally wanted you all as a closing activity to walk around and write down what you thought those were on the pieces of paper to kind of discuss it. One of them is Miss Piggy's plane crash. And there's actually a plane in the subarctic, in Churchill, literally still with wheels, everything on it. The chairs look totally fine, but it's a plane crash that happened that nobody addressed and was just left there. Why? Churchill, for the Cold War, was the military base for Canada and the United States to launch rockets into Russia and essentially practice all of these things, try to figure out what Aurora Borealis really was. And where I did my research, there were still dumpsters containing nuclear waste that just sit there. So yeah, I wanted to also kind of dive into that reality because how do you keep language and culture when your land is dead? And that's something that I identify with coming from Superfund sites.
I just very, very quickly wanted to also, the presentation blew my mind, but I also wanted to thank you for acknowledging the indigenous people in Russia, because we don't know very much. We always think of Russia as this totalitarian evil empire. And we don't really consider that, there are indigenous peoples in Siberia and in those places, and that Russia is an evil, colonial country as well. And those people have been so suppressed and terrorized for so long, and the world is not really paying attention. So I wanted to thank you for that.
Any other questions?
I have just a question out of ignorance. What are Superfund sites?
No, that's totally fine. So Superfund sites, that is a great question, actually. And I guess feel free for any other Americans in the room who might want to jump on that. Superfund sites are locations in which the Environmental Protection Agency has declared too polluted, too dangerous, and no longer worthy of being spaces for people to essentially live on, grow anything on. It's considered dead land, and it's the colonial version of identifying dead land. The only difference, though, is although New Jersey has 5 Superfund sites, my tribe is allowed to stay there, whereas the rest of the country would not be. So.
Any other questions? Because I also have my own that I might pose. Okay, great. I really appreciated your talk. And I think what was really interesting to me was the conversation about the Antarctic area and how it's essentially co-managed, right? Yeah. Internationally. And I was thinking about that in terms of my own research lately and what I want to study is the differences and nuances in terms of how access is conveyed when you have co-management agreements versus actual land back. And I've been hearing a lot that co-management is the new thing to go for. How do you feel about that? Because I don't know, these agreements have different connotations and different ways that they get done, right? But I'm just curious, how does that co-management play out in Antarctica and in other places that you've noticed, especially around those sites that are offered for that?
I think co-management, like everything else, is problematic. And I think the most significant reason as to why is because it benefits for some, but not all. And in the cases of land in such secluded, I say it like that because the North is not nearly as secluded as we try to act like. These are communities that love each other and do a lot and understand that to survive, we've always had everything we needed. So I think the co-management issue or topic only becomes an issue when nations aren't heard and followed through exactly. And I say that because like Wapusk National Park abuts Churchill, and there are a lot of Southern Canadians that are non-Indigenous identifying that are able to have first round picks for internships and programs to be able to work on Indigenous spaces and have that environmental background that is already clout and identified in the colonial world as being great. I would argue that co-management only works when those roles are first filled by Indigenous people and only Indigenous people. I think co-management only works if it's actually having synergy with both the Anglo-Western version of science and our Western version of science. We are the West first. Europe is East. So even in the vernacular conversation, I did Caucasian Anglo-Canadian science. I did not do Western science. My Western science was West Northeastern science by talking to elders. But I think, yeah, co-management, especially because of the financial realities that's forever attached to it, I think become really dangerous. And we've talked a lot about the semantics of trauma, but I think also can be traumatic because some nations we have had those people who leave and are supposed to come back with the word of what the colonizer is doing, or, you know, we've had those Indigenous people that learn English first, but still keep their mother tongue and go back and forth. And I think when we talk about co-management, we're now using Indigenous people to do that with the land. And that is very traumatic. And that's why I guess I argue that science is our way of, it's the planetary language. Science and math almost everywhere in the world is taught more or less the same, except for within Indigenous communities. We do that by following our cultural traditions. We do that by learning how to make a pemiwakan or a wigwam or a longhouse or a teepee. And I think going back to those things is our form of management, as well as our creation stories, and bringing empathy back into science is what's missing from the colonizer's view. So we can only co-manage once they identify communities need science, scientists need communities, and the land needs empathy again. I know I'm super over time, but for Minnesota in relation to line 3, this was the first time I actually put sovereign science into play. And the Minnesota Women's Press did an article on some of the work that myself, as well as Anishinaabe Two-Spirit Giwaden put together. And we went out and we tested some of the first frack outs and oil spills that Enbridge, a Canadian company, did in the United States and is continued to doing. I also want to shed light on the Arctic nations that are fighting right now. Wet'suwet'en, Wenzenqua was just harmed and opened. It's one of the only freshwater systems left in Canada. And unfortunately, it's been penetrated. The Sepquamic, I just shout out to all of my people fighting. Land back.
Thank you so much, Keshia.